G'day guys, welcome back to the next session of the Trohet speaker building course. In this session we're going to be doing sanding. So we're going to sand our speaker cabinets, make them smooth, get rid of all the glue stains, any dents that we might have, and the end result is that we're going to get the timber just ready for putting the finish on. There are two ways that we can do the sanding. We can do it by hand, so the hand sander, which is a cork block, and what you do is you put your sandpaper around it and off you go. This is a lot more work, it's a bit of elbow grease, but you know, it works. It's just a great technique. It just takes a bit more time. If you want to save some time, then get one of these things, an orbital sander. These things save a lot of time, and if you want to do woodwork, I highly recommend getting one because time is precious really, isn't it? And you can get through wood really fast with this thing. But if you want to do it by the hand sanding technique, that's absolutely fine. This thing and this thing will give you the same result. So there's no benefit in terms of the surface finish at the end anyway. This video is going to be broken up into two stages. The first stage is using the power sander. I'll show you guys how to do it, and then it'll follow on into an old video I did for the Copenhagen speaker model, which is another speaker kit that I've designed. And you'll follow through with that on the hand sanding technique. You notice that the speaker is different, but the process is still the same. So when doing the power sanding, you're going to want to have a piece of cardboard down on your bench. You really don't want to be denting your speaker cabinets while you're sanding them. Otherwise, each time you sand it, you flip it over, you can get a dent, and then you've got to start from square one again. So work with something that's clean, that's flat and soft. Cardboard works just fine for this. While we're sanding, we also want to make sure that we keep the cardboard clean. We don't want to, say for instance, when we're sanding with 80 grit, a bit of the sand particle from the 80 grit sandpaper will come off and they'll go onto the cardboard. Then when we go to 120 grit, we don't want the 120 grit sandpaper to be mixing with 80 grit sand particles. Otherwise we're going to have an 80 grit sanding job. So between every grit, you want to make sure that you're keeping your cardboard clean. You're also going to want to wear a mask. There's no shortage of these around, keeping the dust out of our lungs. And I highly recommend wearing a pair of safety glasses. I'm going to wear my spectacles, but you can wear whatever you like. Your sunnies, safety glasses, spectacles like I am, all good. You're also going to want to wear clothing that you're happy to get dirty. It gets very dusty, so don't be wearing any flashy clothes because you're going to get all sanding dust on them. And also do your sanding outdoors or in, like I am, in a place that's suitable for it. I'm in my garage, so I'm happy for the dust to go around here. Don't do it in your lounge room. I really don't recommend it. You know, don't do it in your bedroom. It's going to go all through your clothes and through your bed. No good, no bueno. So I'm going to show you guys how to sand the solid wood version. So this is the American Adler solid timber, and I'll also show you guys how to sand the plywood with the electric sander. The plywood in this case is birch. It's got pretty fine layers, so you don't want to go too hard on the sanding because if you punch through one layer, you're going to hit the other, and it's going to be not a very good look unless that's what you're going for. But yeah, be very careful and mindful when doing when sanding the plywood with the electric sander. So I'm going to start off with 80 grit. I'm going to do all the sides first, and then I'm going to move up to the next grit, up to 120, then go 180, and then 240. I highly recommend forming a system. What I'm going to do is I'm going to sand both my sides, then I'm going to sand my top and bottom, and then I'm going to do the front and back in that order, so that way I remember what side I've sanded. There's nothing worse than sanding it and then you don't remember what side and you lose track. So make sure you remember that. When sanding, you want to keep this thing flat, just move back and forth, making sure that you know where you went. But what we're going to do with the 80 grit is we're just going to go in there real quickly and take off any glue marks, any high bits on these edges, just knock them down. And really, you don't really need to do anything in here, just on the edges really where the glue is. I've sanded it with 80 grit. Now I'm going to go 120, 180 and 240. So I finished my speaker cabinets by using the power sander, and I finished off with the hand sanding bit. They're feeling real good, so smooth. Like, it's amazing how much transformed they've been. You know, before they were quite rough, a lot of glue on it. Now they're spotless, ready for varnish. What we're going to go into now is how to do the sanding completely by use of a hand sander. So what you'll notice is that the speakers are a bit different. They're actually my Copenhagen model, which is the model below these, but the sanding process is exactly the same. So enjoy, and see you in the next video. Hey, now that we've glued the speaker cabinet together, we're ready to proceed to the next step. Step 2 of building the speakers. It's going to be broken down into 2 parts. The first part is about sanding, getting sandpaper and really getting that rough timber into something smooth. And then from that, we're going to follow on into finishing the speaker. Thing to consider when sanding. Number 1 is make sure you got your workbench protected by the cardboard. Number 2, think about ventilation. If you can sand outdoors, that's the best thing you can do. If you can't sand outdoors and you can only sand indoors, then your best friend is going to be the vacuum cleaner. You know why? Because it can suck up the dust. Not even connected. Tricked. Another thing to consider is wear a dust mask. Masks are great at not only stopping you from getting COVID-19, but stopping the dust from getting in your lungs. In the speaker kit, you've got sandpaper. You've got 4 of 80 grit, 2 of 120, 2 of 180, and 2 of 240. Let's talk about grits. What is grit? It's actually a measurement of how coarse the sandpaper is. So 80 grit is much coarser than, say, 160 grit. And in actual fact, 80 grit is twice as coarse as 160. So when you double the number, you get twice as coarse. When we sand, we work from the coarsest grit and go to the finest. The first step to sanding is starting with the coarse grit. So 80 grit. Then we're going to move up to 120 grit, 180, and 240. So let's start with 80 grit. 80 grit is a coarse grit. The reason why we're going to start at 80 grit is so that we can get out the heavy scratches, but also you'll notice that your box, the edges of the timber is a little bit higher than the rest of the timber. The 80 grit great at bringing that down so it's flush. Say for instance, if you try to do this with 240 grit, you're going to be there for days. So we can save a lot of time by going 80 grit, getting all the heavy sanding done first. You might be asking, how do I know if it's 80 grit? Well, on the back of the grit, you'll see an 80. If you don't see a number on it, you can also feel it. You can feel that 80 grit is much coarser. It's the coarsest one in the kit. So when we sand, it's imperative that we sand in the direction of the grain. When you look at the direction of the grain, what you're seeing a pattern like this. You don't want to sand across the grain, but what's going to happen is you're going to put scratches in the timber. When you put scratches in the direction of the grain, you can't discern the difference between a scratch or the grain pattern, and therefore you can't see the scratch. So really, make sure that when you're sanding, you're going back and forth. No cross movements, nothing like that. We're going to do 80 grit for both speakers. Once we've done that, we'll move on to 120 grit. With your cork block and your 80 grit sandpaper, you're going to wrap the sandpaper around the block. Your fingers are going to hold the side of it. With the 80 grit, come down, one hand on the speaker box, hold it really firmly, and with the other hand, push into it. You don't have to push really hard, but a firm amount of pressure. Once you've done your 80 grit sanding, you might see that there's some holes in the joints or anywhere on the timber that you might want to fix. So what I'm going to show you is how to use a sanding dust to fill those holes. The sanding dust that we collected is the same timber, therefore it's got the same colour. So what we're going to do is put the dust into the cracks and then fill it with super glue. The super glue is there to hold the wood together, so it will make a filler that's really strong but also neutrally coloured. So when you're filling a gap like this, you want to be working so that the gap is facing upwards. The first step, to get some of the dust, and just sprinkle it onto your piece. And you just want to massage it into the hole. And once you've massaged it in, just pushing it in as much as you can, you're going to pull it away, and you can see it like that. But what you want to do is you want to make sure that it doesn't sink in. You want it to be flat and level. So a good way to achieve that is leave sanding dust on your workpiece with your super glue. Just pour a little bit in there. Just don't put too much in. That's just going to glue that stuff in nicely, and then just put the sanding dust over the top of it and push it down into that groove so it will stick to that glue that's already there. And then what you can do, come back over the top. This is the hard bit because you can't actually see where the crack is, but you just need to remember where it is. You might need 2 goes at doing this. It's a bit of an art really. I've done this quite a fair few times, but just be patient and you'll be surprised how well a gap can be sealed and look like there's no gap at all. And then you just bring away any excess dust. You may as well collect it and use it for another hole if you have any. So what we see here is the joint of the side panel against the bottom panel, and it hasn't quite touched. So what's that telling me? During the gluing process, I just didn't pull this side down enough. To remediate this, I'm going to fill this gap with sanding dust and then fill it with super glue. Just massage it in. I always love doing this bit because it's always like a great way to make your mistakes look like they never actually happened. And only you will ever know about these mistakes. Nobody will know about them. So that's the beautiful thing about making something yourself, is that you know the history of it, and people see it, they think it's all perfect. In actual fact, it really is. Sprinkled magic dust over it. Take away the excess. What we have here is we've got a mild gap. I think it's glued down, it's just a slight bit of a rolled edge, and it's nothing to be alarmed about. But if you do want to fix something like this, I highly recommend getting a bit of masking tape. I'm leaving about a 1mm gap. Get the sanding dust and just fill it in. Get some more sanding dust, sprinkle it over the top. And leave that dry for a minute and peel off the masking tape. Any excess masking tape can be sanded off with 80 grit sandpaper. I've been sanding to 80 grit, and what can happen sometimes when you sand is that you can actually get a bit of tear out in the timber. If you look here, there's a bit of timber come loose. Well, it could even crack off. In some instance, you could have a bit of timber crack off. Find the bit of the timber that cracked off, and we can glue it back on with super glue. What you'll want is a bit of cardboard from the gluing process. You want a cork block, and you'll want the super glue. I would like to note that super glue does stick, and if you get it stuck to your fingers, it's not a pleasant feeling, so don't get it stuck to your fingers. If you feel like you're a bit clumsy and you can get your hands stuck together, then wear gloves. That will save you big time. So what you see with super glue, if you haven't used one before, you can open it by using this little bit in the middle. And when you push that in, or push a hole in here and open the super glue. When you do it, just make sure that it's away from your eyes. And see that? There's the hole. Screw the lid back on. So what we want to do is we want to get some glue in here so we can glue it down. There's many ways to do it, but the best way to do it is to get the glue to travel down by gravity. Pulling the speaker box up, And when you do this, try and add a very little amount. You don't want it to drip, and when it does drip, it's going to require a lot of sanding to get the drip mark out. So just very gently pull it back. Put the lid back on, place it down on the side, put your cardboard down, and just press. Once you've let it dry for a couple of minutes, take off the cork block. And what will happen is it's most likely that the cardboard is going to stick down to the wood. So just very carefully pull it back, making sure you don't pull off the bit of chipped wood. I'm going to go back in with 80 grit and get that bit of cardboard off. So there you have it. We've fixed the crack by adding some super glue. The next step to this process is sanding to 120 grit. 120 grit sanding is pretty much the same thing as 80 grit, but the difference is there's a lot less work involved. So what we're going to do is we're going to count our strokes this time. So we're going to count our strokes 10 times. You're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then you're going to move over to the next bit and go 1, 2, all the way to 10, and keep going across. The reason why we're doing that is so that we can get a really even amount of sanding. This is a technique that actually I learned from making surfboards. When you make a surfboard, you want to count your strokes so that your surfboard is symmetrical. And the same thing is applied when we're building a speaker. You don't want one side to be really sanded or one corner to be really sanded. And when you run your hand over it, it's like, I went a little bit too far there. You're going to do one piece of 120 grit sandpaper for each speaker. And to tell if it's 120, you'll see a 120 on the back of it. So just very gently, you're going to sand. And make sure when you're sanding, you're not falling into the grooves and making them round. We want to keep them really square so that when you put the tweeter and woofer in there, you get a nice transition between the tweeter and the wood. And you really don't need much sanding at all for this. Because we've gone in with 80 grit, we've done all the heavy work. We're just removing the scratches that your 80 grit made. When you come into the middle bit, you need to be super careful. The way I do it is get your sanding block, put it down over the top of the middle of between the woofer and the tweeter, and just do very small little movements like this. Because there's such little wood here, it doesn't require much sanding. So for instance, if you're sanding on a side panel, you can put a lot of pressure, but because there's such little wood here, the smallest amount of movement will remove a lot of timber. And literally, that is enough. I'm just going to go outside now and do the rest of my sanding for the side, the backs, and the top and the bottom, just so that I don't have heaps of dust in my lounge.